Hello everyone, my name is Colby Brown and I'm here with B&H to talk about all things landscape photography focused. Now in this 4-part video series, we're going to cover a lot of different things, talking about the intro and basics into landscape photography, what it is, how to take impactful images, talking about the gear, cameras, lenses, filters, tripods, and much more. I'm also going to walk you through a scene of how I actually approach landscape photography, talking about composition, subject selection, and much more. And then we're going to wrap up the video series talking about editing. How do you process your landscape images? How do you create more impactful use of those images using light and different types of filters and stuff in the post-processing side of things? Now, either way, I'm really excited to be here. I hope you guys are too. We got a lot to cover, so go ahead and jump right in. So starting things off, we are actually out here in Dingman Falls State Park in Pennsylvania, eastern Pennsylvania, not too far outside of New York City in New York. Now we're here, like I said, to talk about landscape photography, and there's really a lot for us to cover. So let's go ahead and jump right in. So what is landscape photography? If wildlife photography focuses on most things that are living out there, living creatures, and say macro photography focuses on the small things like plants or other beautiful things that we typically step over, landscape photography focuses on the natural things of pretty much everything else. So think of beautiful grand vistas with beautiful sunsets. Think of beautiful forests like we have out here in Dingman Falls. This is landscape photography at its core. So that's a really great segue into talking about the idea of what's the difference between a snapshot and a photograph. Now, a snapshot is essentially something that you take to just capture a moment in time. You're walking down a walkway like this, you grab out your cell phone, you take a photo. It's a moment that's frozen in time that you might want to share with other people out there. Whereas a photograph has a bit more behind it. It has a bit more intent. There's something else for it to say. And to me, that's the biggest difference between the two. So when I think of landscape photography, I usually like to think of it like I am telling a story. And using that analogy is a really great way in order to help you create more interesting or at least impactful images. So what do I mean by that? If you think of a general story, you have a main character, you have a protagonist, a hero of your story. Now with landscape photography, that is your choice of subject. This could be anything from a beautiful waterfall to a reflection to color patterns that you're seeing, pretty much anything that you see out there. You want to identify what your hero is of your story because it's that origin point that should help dictate all the other choices that you make out there in the field. So having a good composition is like having a good plot line. You want people to pay attention to what you're trying to show them, and you want to give them some clues along the way to help lead them down the pathway of what everything you want to show them. And we're going to talk a little bit more about composition later, so don't worry too much about that. Now, when it comes to the emotional side of things, the atmosphere of your story, that's really where it comes down to exposure. Now, your choice of shutter speed, aperture, and ISO could really make a big difference in terms of how people feel about your image, the colors that are represented into it, and the amount of light or darkness that you include inside your image can really change the overall feeling and aesthetic of what you're going for. So if you're just shooting in the auto mode with your camera, you're letting the camera decide what is the most creative way in order for you to expose for your image, where I like to shoot more so in the creative mode. So manual mode, TV mode, aperture priority mode. Those modes give me a bit more control over how the exposure is going to help tell the story that I want to share with my viewers. So now that we've talked about the core concepts of what landscape photography actually is, and we've talked about the difference between a snapshot and a photograph, we've talked a little bit about storytelling, let's talk about 3 of the core pillars that make up a good landscape image. Now, first and foremost, one of the core elements comes down to subject selection. Now, we've talked about this a little bit before, but it's really important, and it's an element that I think a lot of photographers tend to overlook. Now, what do I mean by that? I mean that generally a lot of landscape photographers tend to look at a scene, and they typically just take a picture because it's beautiful, because it's a nice image that they think they're going to capture. But remember, that is a snapshot and not a photograph, which again comes down to intent. It comes down to the story behind it that makes it unique or makes it interesting. So defining out what that subject is really can make a huge difference for you when it comes to the type of landscape photography you're trying to get into. Identifying what that subject is, whether it is a pattern, a color, an emotion, a reflection, different types of light, whatever it is, you want to define that out from the very beginning because it's that origin point that will dictate everything else for you moving forward. Now next, how do you create more impactful landscape images? Really comes down to depth for me. you really want to try to find ways to break through that 2D barrier to create something that's more unique, something that's more engaging, showing a bit more of your frame. And like I said, we're going to talk a little bit of that in a further video. Now, for the third core element of what makes an impactful landscape image, let's talk a little bit about perspective. So what do I mean by perspective? Most photographers, whether they're shooting landscape or not, tend to photograph at the same perspective, which is eye level. They set up on a tripod or they're hand holding their camera and they shoot from right where their normal perspective is. Now the problem with this is that over time it gets a little bit boring if everyone's photographing at the same perspective level. So what I recommend is that you try to mix things up. Get down, crouch down into the ground, change your perspective, because it can drastically change the look and the feel of the image that you're trying to create. Now, a great way to do this is, like I said, to either crouch down, you can also stand high, try to elevate yourself, stand on a rock, if you can safely do it, or use things like drones to give you an aerial perspective, which will completely change the look and feel of the image that you're trying to create. Now, as you can see, we are out here in nature, which is one of the core elements when it comes to landscape photography. You have to deal with the weather, you have to deal with the climate, clouds, rain, all sorts of things that are outside of your control. Now, when it comes to logistical planning, this is a really important element to understand because unlike when you're working in a studio where you can control every aspect, you don't have that option when you're working out there in nature. So when it comes to planning for your next landscape outing, you want to take a couple things into account. Now, first and foremost is weather. You want to make sure you look at the forecast and make sure that you're planning ahead, make sure you have the right clothing, whether it's for heat or for cold, for rain or sunshine. You want to make sure that those things are covered. Now, in addition to that, understanding the direction of light can make a huge difference when it comes to the types of images that you're trying to capture out there. Now, photographing a subject that's in direct light is going to be vastly different during the day than it is maybe early in the morning or later in the afternoon, kind of the tail ends of the day when you get a bit more softer light. But either way, you should plan ahead to make sure you take all of that into account. So with all of that in mind, I tend to put a huge emphasis on scouting locations before I actually go out to photograph them. So what do I mean by scouting? I like to come to an area like Dingman Falls here a couple days before we're actually shooting and look for perspective compositions, interesting subject matter, things that I tend, or at least I plan to photograph when there's better light out there. Now, most of the times that I'm photographing a lot of my landscape images, it is in that early morning sunrise or sunset time frame. But I need to take into account that when the light is fading, I don't want to be running around a scene and not really know what I'm trying to do or what I'm trying to capture. Scouting a location beforehand can give you all that information, make you prepared when you actually get there in the field with the right light, so your gear is ready, you're ready, and you have the best chance to come away with the best images possible. Now, one of the best ways to actually scout a location without actually visiting it is to use some of the new mobile apps that have become popular over the last few years. Now, I'm talking about apps like PhotoPills or TPE or Sun Surveyor, depending on the mobile operating system that you are using. Now, what you can do with these apps is not only check for weather, you can actually check for the direction of sunlight and moonlight. You can follow the paths of the moon or the sun up in the sky using augmented reality and the camera that's on your phone, pointing it at the sky and being able to track exactly where the moon or the sun's going to be at a given time. You can follow different pathways for the Milky Way. You can do all sorts of pretty amazing things, making sure that you are prepared before you even set foot on the ground in these different locations. So if you get a chance, definitely check out some of these apps out there. Like I said, PhotoPills, TPE, Sun Surveyor, and there's a few other ones out there that will help get you more prepared before you visit a location for the first time. So now that you guys have had a crash course in landscape photography, what it is and what it's about, I think now it's time to talk about camera gear. So in the next video, we're going to talk about cameras, lenses, filters, tripods, and other accessories that's going to make your landscape photography adventure much more easier in the process. See you guys then.